The world is facing a global crisis of climate change, which is posing a significant threat to the environment and its biodiversity, human lives and economies world over. However, the impacts of climate change are not gender neutral due to existing structural gender inequalities and power imbalances. As a result, men and women experience and are affected differently by climate change. The UN Human Rights Council resolution of 2009 recognizes that the effects of climate change will be felt most acutely by those segments of the population that are vulnerable owing to geographical location, gender, age, income status, among others.
Ekinkalubyamu olw'okukyukakyuka okw'obwire nalimanga ekifo kino nga nfuna mu Dumansa wa 15 saawa eno nfuna mu ndala oluusi kira 5. Nasomesa abaana bana nga mbasomesa nsima mwogo natunda nabasomesa nagula ku sabuni chumbi nerabira nga nze omuntu ewaka nga ndabira n'abaana bange.
Women are therefore at significant risk of being adversely affected by climate change through increased burden of household care, agricultural work and displacement resulting from climate impacts. Moreover, in the aftermath of disasters, women and children constitute 80% of those requiring assistance, with poor women being 14 times more likely to die during a natural disaster. Uganda has formulated several policies, strategies and plans to address climate change and its impacts while enhancing its legal and institutional framework. These efforts represent the country's domestic contribution to climate action and transition towards a low-carbon and climate-resilient economy in the near future.
Uganda has done a tremendous job in putting in place policies, plans and strategies to ensure that we have climate change, adaptation, mitigation and resilience. For instance, we have the National Climate Change Policy and the Climate Change Act. And we also have the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions that are very critical in ensuring that as a country we are able to have resilience towards the impact of climate change.
However, poor and marginalized communities, predominantly women and minority groups such as Indigenous people, forest and pastoralist communities have lower capacity to adapt and mitigate impacts of climate change due to limited access to timely and accurate climate information, including forecasts and early warnings, as well as limited access to climate change financial resources. Insufficient financial support creates obstacles to developing and expanding locally led climate action. Funds allocated for climate change often do not reach local communities in poor and disaster-prone regions. Innovative financing mechanisms that channel resources to diverse communities to implement resilience practices and mitigate vulnerability to climate change-induced disasters and calamities can play a crucial role in fostering climate-resilient socio-economic development.
We realize that resources, climate action resources, are not reaching the local communities or are not channeled directly to local communities or to people or persons that are most affected by climate change. And when that happens, then we don't have sustainable processes at play. The traditional financing mechanisms really do not channel resources to local communities. They do not channel resources to people that are most affected by climate change. Yet there's a lot of knowledge, local expertise that these communities can be able to use to be able to, to adapt and to build the resilience of climate change.
For many years, grassroots women, local communities and Indigenous people have been viewed as a vulnerable group in the context of climate change. They have been perceived as victims and beneficiaries rather than as key actors who can mend and improve their communities from the effects of climate change. This situation has placed grassroots women in local and Indigenous communities at a disadvantage when trying to access resources to scale their practices for local adaptation and resilience building. The principles for locally led adaptation guide programs, funding mechanisms, and practices toward effective and sustainable community-led adaptation include devolving decision-making to the lowest appropriate level, addressing structural inequalities faced by women, youth, children, disabled, displaced, Indigenous people, and marginalized ethnic groups, providing patient and predictable funding that can be accessed more easily, investing in local capabilities to leave an institutional legacy, building a robust understanding of climate risk and uncertainty, flexible programming and learning, ensuring transparency and accountability, and collaborative action.
What we do at UCOBAC is that we have a mechanism, a field-tested mechanism that ensures that resources are directly channeled to local communities. And this is the Community Resilience Diamond. Through the Community Resilience Diamond, resources, community resilience funds, are allocated to local communities, to organized groups of women, grassroots women, that use their knowledge, use their expertise to be able to come up with solutions to impacts of climate change based on what their priorities are. For instance, if the impacts of climate change are around impacts on their livelihoods, impacts on food security, then they are able to map the risks that they are facing in climate change and are able to come up with local solutions to be able to adapt and to build their resilience to these impacts of climate change.
Anchored in these principles, grassroots women in local and Indigenous communities are taking the lead in designing solutions to prepare, adapt to, and mitigate climate shocks and stresses. Studies show that when women participate as decision makers in resilience and disaster plans, their communities are better equipped to manage and adapt to the impacts of climate change.
We struggle to see that we map the risks. And these risks, we found that we have the risk of floods and drought. Because when there's too much rain, sincerely speaking, you'll not get anything. Your crops will go away. And when there's too much sunshine, truly speaking, it will dry. Because when you're a leader, you cannot just sit and wait that maybe the government will come and help you. With my fellow women, we sat together. We got a solution for these too much floods. So we made trenches for that water to move, so that it cannot move away with our crops. We also said no. When there's too much sunshine, what can we do? Too much drought. We should plant trees that are friendly with our crops. You know, when you plant, there are some trees that you can plant that cannot move around with your crops. It can just spoil the crop. But for us, we chose those trees, we know them. Those trees that our grandfathers used to have. Don't use these eucalyptus, no.
One example of this effort is the Community Resilience Fund, CRF, a field-tested mechanism that seeks to empower grassroots women in local and Indigenous communities to emerge as leaders and key actors in climate change adaptation and resilience building. The CRF is a mechanism for channeling resources to diverse communities to operationalize resilience practices and reduce their vulnerability to climate change-induced hazards and calamities. Anchored in the Huairou Commission's Resilience Diamond Vehicle for Women's Empowerment, Gender Equality and Resilience, the CRF mechanism operates through 4 key elements that work in tandem to strengthen women's leadership and networks for locally led adaptation and resilience. The elements include 1. Enhancing leadership, 2. Demonstrating expertise, 3. Building coalitions and constituencies, 4. Influencing policy.
Waliwo enkyukakyuka ezzeewo eri abakyala betukulembedde era ne mu bulamu bwaffe. Tusobodde okugoberera ennima y'omulembe gye batusomesa kubanga batugamba tutayiminga ebiseera eby'okulimiramu. Bwe tuba tutayiminze ate naddala nze ntera okulima enva nfukirira. Oba akasana kwekali ntera okufukirira. Oba enkuba weeri ne tutambula n'embeera bulungi. Amakungula ne gaba nga si mabi nnyo.
Era UCOBAC etwegeresa ebintu bingi kuba etuleeteire abantu abatulinonola ku nnima y'omulembe n'engeri yetutambuzaamu obwire nga bukyuse oba bwa musana oba bwa maadhi. Butiifu abakazi otuli mu UCOBAC titubulirirwa iva titukajja ku miriraano nti tusurvive.
They've had alternative businesses that they're doing such that they can at least have a source of income in case they fail to get something from the garden. They are able to get something to feed their families, for example, out of the businesses that they are doing. They are also doing what we call collective bargaining and also selling their goods as a collective. As a result of this project, instead of selling your maize as an individual, let's put together, have a higher quantity, and we can bargain for higher prices. We've also seen several women joining leadership because of the capacity strengthening that they got.